So welcome to our Lenten study for 2023, Journeying with John, travelling through Lent with the fourth Gospel. We're going to do a couple of sessions before we get into following the lectionary passages during most of Lent, which come from John's Gospel. Today we're going to do an overview of the Gospel, and next week we're going to look at the opening chapter. So in the material that hopefully you have got and are able to open, you would have received an overview of John's Gospel, which is a very distinctive Gospel when you put it alongside Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It begins with a very different take on Jesus, and it tells a somewhat different story from the other three Gospels. We're going to look at that in the course of this session. The author of this work, in the work, according to chapter 21, the author of this work is this anonymous, tantalizing figure within the body of Jesus' disciples, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And the disciple whom Jesus loved is mentioned a number of times in John's Gospel, but in chapter 21, it's he that claims to be the author. Over time, this evangelist came to be equated with the disciple John, who was the son of Zebedee and the brother of James. Peter and Andrew, James and John, the first four disciples. But there's nothing in the text that actually says this is John. That's the tradition. Now, in my workings with John's Gospel and reading what people have said about it over the years, one thing that I find quite interesting is the somewhat symmetrical arrangement of the Gospel as a whole. You can see that there's an opening prologue and there is a closing epilogue that kind of frame the work. And then inside that frame, there is the second half of chapter 1 is a prelude which introduces Jesus and some of his followers. And this doesn't exactly correlate, but at the end, we have the whole sequence of passion narrative leading to resurrection narrative. That's probably the weakest part of the analogy. But in between the prelude and the beginning of the passion narrative, we have the book of signs. Lots of scholars call it that. I've adopted that name for the whole of John's Gospel because it's a distinctive element. John refers explicitly to signs that Jesus performed on a number of occasions. If you work through chapters 2 to 12, you'll see there are 7 signs, 7 miracles. There's also discourses where Jesus teaches. He engages in conversation and then he teaches. That's what's going to be the basis of our Lenten passages when we get into the season of Lent. There are dialogues and controversies with the Jerusalem authorities in this section. That's the book of signs. Then from chapter 13 through to chapter 17, there is what's called the farewell discourse of Jesus, or sometimes the farewell discourses of Jesus. Of course, it might be divided into 2. There's the setting for these discourses at the last meal of Jesus, which we're familiar with, both from our monthly or regular communion services, but also from the ending, the last section of each of the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So there's the last meal, but it's somewhat different in John's Gospel. There's a farewell discourse that goes through chapters 13 and 14. Another one, it seems to end and then he seems to start again, maybe some kind of editor joining things together. A second farewell discourse in chapters 15 and 16, and ends with a long prayer, often called the high priestly prayer of Jesus in chapter 17. Then we move to the passion narrative, resurrection narrative, and the epilogue. So there's a nice symmetrical structure, kind of, and there is also a very distinctive aspect. The majority of the miracles in chapters 2 to 12 are not found in the synoptics. Some of them are, but most of them aren't. And certainly the whole the way in which the meal of Jesus is described and the farewell discourses in chapters 13 through to 16 and the high priestly prayer in chapter 17, very little correlation with the synoptic gospels. So that leads to the first question about John's gospel. Why was this gospel written in such a distinctive way? And we're going to start in our typical style with asking you in breakout rooms to discuss this question. What do you think about why the gospel might have been written in such a distinctive way? And then we'll come back and share our wisdom.
Hello, I can see you're having some very learned discussions from Sherry's comments.
It cut me off mid-sentence.
It does that. Zoom is ruthless. It throws you out.
Elizabeth, that we didn't get terribly far with it, but right at the end we got into a discussion. It must have been written by one of the disciples. If it wasn't written by John, it must have been one of the others, because right in the last couple of verses of the chapter, in chapter 21, it says, "This was written by me, one of the disciples, the disciple that Jesus loved." So I guess, is that just a gloss tacked on later by whoever it was who wrote it to make it look as if it was written by a disciple?
Well, there's two things in that, Ian. One is that a lot of scholars believe that chapter 21 was actually a later edition, not part of the initial body of the work. And the second is that a group of American scholars in the 1980s and 90s developed a theory that there are actually layers of tradition in John's Gospel, that parts of it do go back to an eyewitness or to eyewitnesses, but that the way that the stories, the way that the accounts of that eyewitness or those eyewitnesses were remembered and passed on in the community that we call John's community, got developed and extended. And so Raymond Brown, the great American Jesuit scholar, who wrote a massive 2-volume work on John's Gospel, his hypothesis was that he could see 4 stages of development. So chapter 21 would be the last stage. The sum of the things about John's Gospel that look historically reliable go to the earliest eyewitness testimony, but there's been a development shaped and influenced by the life of the community, and particularly because 3 times in the gospel it says that that followers of Jesus were expelled from the synagogue, that actually reflects something strongly in the Johannine community. So it's a complicated thing.
I don't want to sidetrack us, but for us, ordinary, common, church-attending believers, there's a problem here. We're not biblical scholars. We tend to take the Gospels at face value. We don't have the learning and the years of study to penetrate to that level, and it's only by attending discussions like this that we do. And at other times, if I read the gospel and it says it was written by the beloved disciple, I tend to take that at face value and say, hey, this was written by the beloved disciple. John, wasn't it? I'm connected with John, and that's a wonderful thing.
No, that's fine. Yeah, so these studies do delve into areas that we don't get just in the. Here's the gospel for Sunday. Let's think about it for 20 minutes, and then we move on.
Yeah. Part of the problem in answering your question too is the age of the book of John. Most people who study these things believe it was written towards the end of the 1st century or the beginning of the early 2nd century, which would make the author impossibly old. If that author had been a disciple, he'd be 110 or something like that, which was highly unlikely in the ancient world for someone to live that long and pen this narrative. So that's the other complicating factor around who wrote this book.
I think being written by somebody who actually knew Jesus, or is it written by somebody who's just heard the stories and decides to be a
Probably.
ghostwriter for John.
Yeah, probably.
For 2 years, Jesus only had 4 disciples. He had Andrew and an unnamed disciple. He had Philip and he had Nathaniel. They're the only 4 that were with Jesus for 2 years. Peter and John and James only joined after the death of John the Baptist. They were only him, and that's why Mark's gospel is so short. Mark was writing what Peter did, where Peter was telling him, and Peter wasn't there at the Cana. He wasn't there at the woman at the well. He wasn't there for 2 years.
That chronology is probably John's gospel,
eyewitness accounts
Derek.
are possibly the unnamed disciple.
Part of the problem that you're posing there is the chronology of the 3 of Matthew, Mark, and Luke aren't the same as John. So you've got to make up your mind which chronology you're going to put your stamp on and say this is more accurate, which is one of the things we'll be looking at, because that chronology you're describing is only in the Gospel of John. It's not in the Synoptic Gospel. So that's a bit of an issue that we'll be looking at. It isn't straightforward. It's never straightforward when you look at the Bible, because it's a complex piece of literature written by many people in many different circumstances and even cultures over a large span of time.
Shall we push on to the...
Yes, we will.
geography?
Yes, please.
One of the things to note is I always like to note the geography of the gospel. Where did Jesus' ministry take place? And Derek's already referred to this in terms of the 2 years and 3 years. In Mark, followed by Matthew and Luke, any of the chronological indications, and there are not a lot of them, would tend to indicate it was just 1 year that Jesus was active in Galilee before he went to Jerusalem at the Passover. In John's Gospel, we have 3 Passovers. Jesus goes to Jerusalem 3 times, and we know that they're 3 separate Passovers because John then talks about other things in between. This is where we get the tradition of the 3-year ministry of Jesus. He went to Jerusalem in chapter 2 for the Passover. He went back to Galilee. He went back to Jerusalem in chapter 5 for a festival, whatever that might be. Went back. The Passover again in chapter 6. So that's the second Passover. He's at the Sea of Galilee. He's in Jerusalem in chapter 7, despite his disciples not wanting him to go, for the Feast of Tabernacles. He's there for the Feast of Dedication in chapter 10, and he's there for Passover at the end of chapter 11 onwards. So let's note that the first Passover where Jesus goes to Jerusalem in John's Gospel is the Passover when Jesus cleanses the temple, according to John chapter 2. That doesn't appear in Mark until chapter 11. The third Passover, when Jesus goes to Jerusalem with his disciples, is when he has his final meal. He is arrested, tried, and crucified. And of course, in John's Gospel, that has no cleansing of the temple. Mark, followed by Matthew and Luke, that sequence does begin with Jesus entering Jerusalem and cleansing the temple. So that's a point to note when we're thinking about John's Gospel alongside the Synoptic Gospels. So if you were to chart where is Jesus and what's happening, you'll see that Mark doesn't start until Jesus is an adult in Galilee. He reports the activity of Jesus in Galilee. Jesus goes on a journey to Jerusalem. There's a Passover in Jerusalem, and then the arrest, trial, etc.
So this would be at least 3 years.
Well, according to Mark, we only have
1 year.
one Passover indication and nothing really to indicate how much time has transpired before that.
Right.
But Jesus in Mark's Gospel only goes to Jerusalem once. Same in Matthew. He's an infant in Judea. His family goes to Egypt. They come back. He's an adult in Galilee. He does not go to Samaria. He goes to Jerusalem for the Passover and is arrested. In Luke, he is an infant. He does go to Jerusalem as an infant. He does go back to Jerusalem as a youth, but as an adult, he doesn't go to Jerusalem more than once. He decides to go to Jerusalem. He does go through Samaria, a difference between Luke and Matthew. He journeys to Jerusalem and has the Passover. When you try and plot John next to it, you have difficulties. John starts in the beginning, way beyond the birth of Jesus, way beyond, earlier than the birth of Jesus. He has him going to Jerusalem 3 times. He does stay in Samaria in chapter 4. We'll deal with that story in a few weeks. He goes back to Galilee, back to Jerusalem, back to Galilee, in Jerusalem, and then the Passover. So that's
How is it Galilee to Jerusalem?
You see, in Mark 1, chapter 4, verse 14, after John had been arrested, Jesus comes into Galilee, and then he picks up his other disciples. It's only after John has been arrested.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you do have Simon Peter in chapter 1 of John's Gospel with Andrew.
Yes, but he meets him, but he goes back as a disciple of John the Baptist.
So
He doesn't follow Jesus.
So how long would it take on foot?
That's in the Gospel of John, not Mark.
You know, we're
He's finally-
talking
he's finally
years.
called.
We're talking years, not weeks or months.
no,
aren't we?
yeah.
Yeah, probably, Patricia. And he can, if there's only Passover once a year, so that's why John's Gospel is seen as having 3 years of ministry,
Yes.
where the other one says 1 Passover, so it's sort of a condensed 1 year of ministry. John is not like the Synoptic Gospels. The call of the disciples is completely different. The names of the disciples are different, as they are between Matthew and Luke. There's not an agreement, and how they're called is different. And that's one of the great conundrums of biblical scholarship, sorting that one out.
And bearing in mind that they had to walk most places,
They did.
and not like the what is it, the Dudac Rally or whatever it's called, where they could go as fast as they liked in their cars.
No,
would
it's not the
take them-
Dakar Rally.
No, they would take them weeks to get from one place to another.
Probably.
Yes.
Though they were very good walkers in those days, unlike us. They were probably a deal faster than we were because they were used to doing this and were hardened souls. It's just part of the reason why they probably died young too. Life
got
was
worn
tough.
out.
They did get worn and worn out. All right. When did Jesus
In fact,
die?
a very small country that they were walking around too.
It was very small, but you know, from the Sea of Galilee down to Jerusalem is a fair hike, Derek. Let's be
it's fair
reasonable
hike,
here.
but it's, you know, it's only
It's
Sydney
not
to
next
Newcastle.
door.
If you
Sydney
go
to
by the
Newcastle.
Jordan Valley, it's a very difficult walk because you've got to come
Yeah.
up very rugged,
Say how far it is.
desolate. So it's probably about 150 kilometres, but very rugged country.
I mean, I wouldn't like to be setting off on 150 kilometre trot, even on flat ground,
Yeah. Well,
let alone the hilly areas of the biblical lands. And that's why they often went through Samaria or tried to, because where you had to encounter Samaritans, it did avoid some of that topography that was quite difficult. But it depended on what the relationships were between Jews and Samaritans, whether that was a safe bypass. Even though it was longer, it was flatter. Okay, let's move forward on to looking at chronologies. And we're going to start by looking at when Jesus died, because that's a significant thing in the Gospel of John. So in Mark, we have 2 days. Can you move the grey thing off the bottom somewhere else, John, or not? It was 2 days before the Passover, says Mark, and the festival on unleavened bread. And the priests and scribes are looking for a way to arrest Jesus. And on the first day of unleavened bread, the Passover lamb is sacrificed, and the disciples say to him, "Where do you want us to make preparations for the Passover to eat it?" So in the Gospel of Mark and also in Matthew and Luke, they have a Passover meal is being planned, and that's usually what we consider the Last Supper. And here in John, before the festival of Passover, Jesus knows his hour has come. And it was the day of preparation of the Passover, and the crowds cry out, "Crucify him," and Jesus is taken away and he's crucified. Anyone spot the difference?
Well, there's certainly not much love in John, is there?
There's not much love in John. There's not much love in Matthew either when you read his account. But there's a crucial difference here. Can anyone see what it is between Mark and John? What is it?
He didn't have the Last Supper yet.
He didn't have the Passover in John. Is that what you're saying, Henrietta?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Yes, he didn't have the Passover in John. What is the day that Jesus dies? Mark tells you what that day is, but that's not when Jesus dies in Mark. What's happening on the day Jesus dies?
Well, if there's a sacrificial lamb being slaughtered in the temple, and Jesus is at the same time being crucified, not all that far away on Golgotha, he's the sacrificial lamb as well.
Yes.
As it intended to equate Jesus with the sacrificial lamb?
Well, that is what you're about to discuss in your groups, because Henrietta is right. Jesus dies, and Ian is right. Jesus dies in John when the sacrificial lambs are killed, where in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and Mark, he actually celebrates Passover, which is after the sacrificial lambs are killed, and then he is crucified. So your question is, what is the significance? Because this is different timing in John's Gospel. Why do you think he is doing this? What is the significance of this that we find in John? Why is this chronology around the death of Jesus different? And I think Ian was touching on it before you broke into groups.
The death of Jesus and the slaughtering of the lambs in the temple were happening too close together to be logical.
Well, it depends on how you see logic.
Well, it'd be like going to a fringe festival and then there's a coffee cart nearby and you sort of, where would you be? I mean, why would you be going to a slaughtering of the lambs when there's supposedly a more important event happening 200 metres away?
I don't think they're going to the slaughtering of the lambs. That's just the timing. It's just when the slaughter of Jesus is killed at the same time as the lambs are slaughtered. And remember, it's a Roman punishment. The Romans don't care what's going on.
Yeah.
If they're stringing people up during the slaughtering of the lambs for Passover at the temple, that would bother them not one jot. So I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive. The question is, why does John write the way he does? Why does he have Jesus killed at the same time as the lambs?
We sort of thought.
Hang on, one at a time. Henrietta, Bill, and then whoever. Henrietta.
To emphasize the fact that he is a lamb that has been sacrificed for the world, or for our sins.
Yes, so it's emphasising the sacrifice of Jesus as the Lamb of God. Bill?
Well, pretty well the same point, that it anchors the Jesus as the sacrificial lamb as part of this covenant relationship that was cemented in Egypt.
Well, it's certainly, John says at the beginning, John the Baptist says at the beginning of John's Gospel, doesn't he? He calls Jesus the Lamb of God when he sees him. John says to his disciples, there's the Lamb of God. And this actually reinforces that concept that this Jesus is the Lamb of God, and like the lambs of God, he is sacrificed at the same time to emphasize that particular fact. Does anyone else have any comments to make?
Could I just say, in our groups, I pointed out that I've been to Jerusalem on a couple of occasions, and the temple where all the sacrificing was going on is only a couple of 100 metres away from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is purportedly where Jesus was crucified and where also the garden tomb was. Now, if we believe John's chronology, we've got two great shows going on at the same time. We've got all the lambs being sacrificed in the temple. The Jews are putting on their show. At the same time, the Romans are putting on their show, a great spectacle of crucifixion, 3 blokes being crucified only a couple of 100 metres away, with plenty of Jews attending the crucifixion and saying, he saved others himself, he cannot save. I just can't believe that 2 shows like that are going to be happening simultaneously with Jews attending both of them.
Well, there's plenty of Jews. There were thousands and thousands of Jews in Jerusalem for Passover. They can't all be gathered at the temple. And Romans are crucifying people left, right, and centre. Like, it wasn't just a one-off thing. Crucifixion was the Roman punishment for criminals. And so, and sometimes Josephus says that Romans crucified thousands at a time. So 3 crucifixions may not have been the great spectacle.
And it may not have been 3. There may have been hundreds, or indeed,
well, there might have been.
there might have been a lot more. We're just not told.
Or maybe the Romans were doing it at that time to poke an eye further, poke further into the eyes of the Jews. I mean,
that's right. The Romans did aggravate them deliberately. And it may not have been a few 100 metres away. The Romans tended to do crucifixions on the roads leading into cities and towns, and they strung people up along them to be a message against insurrection and insubordination to all who pass by. So, that topography you're talking about, Ian, may or may not be correct. It's just speculation. But the Romans really didn't care what the Jews were doing.
It's pretty unlikely he was crucified at the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I'd say.
I think so. Yeah, I'd have to agree with that, Bill.
Because it was outside the city. It was outside the city walls, wasn't it? Like,
yes.
According to the hymn.
I think that's right. I think according to the synoptics, that's right. It is outside the city walls, and it's on the place known as the Hill of the Skull, or some such. Any other things people want to contribute to that? I mean, John is clearly different. He's clearly doing it for a reason. I think we've established that.
The Passover is about remembering, and I think that lines up with when we talk about the Lamb of God in communion, that whole concept of remembrance.
Yes, yes, that's right. And remembering what happened, yes. All right, we're going to move on to the incident in the temple forecourt, and we'll be looking at Mark 11, who describes what happens when Jesus enters what we call the overturning of the tables in the temple. It's in Mark 11, and it's at the end of Luke and Matthew as well. And looking at it in John, where it happens in chapter 2. And so here we have Jesus in chapter 2 going to Jerusalem, and he finds these things. And he gets very upset, and he says a few things and makes a whip of cords and then drives them out of the temple. And then afterwards, we have this little narration from the author of the Gospel of John that said the disciples remembered afterwards it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And then Jesus says, when he's asked for a sign, he said, "Destroy this temple and raise it up." And they don't get it. This is very common in John, doing this sort of thing. Jesus makes some cryptic remark and everyone goes, huh? Because they take it literally. And it turns out that it's not meant to be taken literally. It's symbolic. And here Jesus is speaking of the temple of his body, not the actual temple. And it gives you a forecast of what's going to happen, that after that, the Jews believed, the disciples believed what he'd said and believed the scripture and the word. So that's going right to the end of the gospel chronologically, but it occurs here in John 2. There's some interesting words in this. When I researched this once before, the whip is a Roman whip, which really surprised me. It's unique to the Gospel of John, this whip that Jesus makes. He sits there and makes this particular Roman plaited cord, and he uses that to drive them out. And you might want to ask yourself too about whether or not all of those animals are found in the temple, and what would be the consequence if Jesus had done this so early on in his ministry. So we've got some more questions for you to look at. This timing, So when you look at Mark, and it's in your handouts, Mark and John, is it the same event? What are the differences? And why do you think those differences might be there? So that'll give you something meaty to get your teeth into. How did you get on with these lengthy questions about the differences between Mark and John?
I felt that Mark gave a very brief description, no violence, throwing whips around and so on, just telling them more or less to get out and stop turning the house of prayer into a marketplace. John's one says that at the end of it, but also talks about him with the whips and so on. I guess a far more violent depiction of it. But they strike me that they're just the same events, that Mark's gospel puts less emphasis on the detail, or maybe they didn't know about whips or whatever, and John's adds the whips. And
I'm sure they did know about whips, but maybe not.
No,
for this
I mean
story.
whips that Jesus was whipping, whereas John's writer of John felt that Jesus was whipping around.
Yep. So clearly it's the same story that's being told here. What about the differences in where they are in each gospel and what happens as a result of them? Any other comments people want to make about this?
It could be the same episode. It could be two different episodes. But John puts it first in his gospel, just to presumably to emphasize that Jesus knew what he was going to do right from the beginning.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, Derek. I think that's bang on. That's exactly why John puts it at the beginning of his gospel. Because it's like John's ministry statement in a way, the same way chapter 4 in the Gospel of Luke sets out what Jesus' ministry is going to be. In many ways, this event in the Gospel of John very early on sets out Jesus' program, if you like, including his death and resurrection. That's all spelled out in this incident. So I think that's exactly right. And that's why it's where it is in the Gospel of John.
And it's come immediately after the first sign. Verse 11, chapter 2, verse 11 says, Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So that first sign, unique to John's gospel, is the wedding at Cana where he turns water into wine. And the comment about the wine containers and the water jars for the Jewish rites of purification also feeds into what Jesus is perhaps doing. So yeah, chapter 2 gives these two striking incidents that really set the scene for this gospel.
Yeah. What leads to Jesus' arrest in each gospel? What leads to Jesus' arrest in the Gospel of Mark?
The incident of the the incident in the temple.
Yeah, the incident
caused
in
the
the temple.
Pharisees to say that they should kill him.
Well, it's the chief priests, actually, not the Pharisees. Let's not
priests,
smash them unnecessarily.
Oh, I only read it a while ago, forgotten already.
Yep,
But it's
chief
interesting in John that that was the Pharisees, and John reckon that, they can't touch this guy. Look at more or less how the people react to him, or something like that. I forget the exact quote, which I found interesting.
What leads to all the trouble and Jesus' death in the Gospel of John? What's the incident?
Lazarus' death and resurrection.
Lazarus' resurrection, which is the seventh sign in the Gospel of John. And so it culminates in Lazarus being raised from the dead, or brought back to life, if you prefer that terminology. So if we were going to look at these about which is more likely to be historical, what would you think?
I would think probably the synoptics.
The synoptics? Well, yeah. Why do you think that, Bill?
I was hoping you weren't going to ask that question.
Sorry.
Well, I think because they're earlier and probably using the same source, closer to the event, and relying more on received traditions.
Yeah, they're
Whereas
earlier.
John is probably, because he's later, he's reflecting more on the on the whole story, and putting things in a more theological framework. So that's the only thing I can think of.
I think that's reasonable because, of course, we've got John having Jesus crucified at the same time the lambs are being killed, which is a highly theological statement, and doesn't agree with Matthew, Mark and Luke about the timing. So they are earlier. It's clear John is doing theology. It's not as, of course, the synoptics do theology too, but it's not as dominant as the Gospel of John. The other question is, you could ask about this is, do you think the Romans would have seen raising of Lazarus in a village outside of Jerusalem as a high security threat, worthy of Jesus' arrest?
No.
No. That's right. It's highly unlikely the Roman governor would have even believed it, let alone if it was true, seen it as a security, a threat. Would the Roman governor, you think, be significantly concerned with a great drama in the temple at Passover?
Yes.
Absolutely, because that could lead to an insurrection or a riot, because we know Jerusalem swelled to hundreds of thousands during the festival of Passover when Jews from all over Israel poured in to honour this feast and sacrifice their lamb or their dove, depending on their wealth. The other thing you could look at with the Gospel of John is he makes some mistakes in his cleansing of the temple. We know they're mistakes. Things like he says there were cattle in the temple court. We know historically cattle were not in the temple court. They were kept in pens some distance from the temple. If you wanted to sacrifice a bull or a cow, you went to another place to get them and have that done. They weren't available in the temple. So there's a few things in there that we know that historically aren't accurate in the account early on in the Gospel of John. Any other comments that people want to make in relation to these, the Gospel of John and the Synoptics in terms of the incident in the temple forecourt? I mean, basically, we're pointing this out to you to say the Gospel of John may not be historically reliable. He's writing a theology, not a biography. He wants to tell you theological truths about Jesus, and he shapes the material he has around that central aim. The Synoptics have a different way of setting out their material, and that is not their central aim. It's one of their aims, but it's not the central one.
So do you want to go to this question?
Yes.
That's
this is the next question. We're going to, having said all of that and what you've read, what might then we conclude about the historical and theological significance of John's Gospel? That's a nice, easy question for you. You will agree.
No.
No. All right. We'll give you a few minutes to go and talk about that. How did you go with that?
What's the question again?
What might we then conclude about the historical value and theological significance of John's Gospel?
Well, you already told us, Elizabeth, that John's chronology is not to be relied on. We can't regard it as an historically accurate chronology. We can look at it as a series of theological expositions, account chronology.
And I think we saw it as maybe more evolved theology, looking back over a longer period of Christian community living and providing this more comprehensive view.
You could look at it in some ways as a midrash on the story of Jesus that develops the significance of various events in Jesus' life and tells them in a midrashic way, the way Jews do. We know the author of the Gospel of John is a Jew because he tells us. He tells us he and his community have been expelled from the synagogue. So you can only be expelled from the synagogue if you're actually practicing in the synagogue, which makes you a Jew. So these techniques about midrash that the Jews use quite frequently would be well known to the author of John. And it seems that's actually what he's doing here. It's a midrashic interpretation of the story of Jesus as the synoptics tell it. I mean, that's...
Can I just observe, I've always liked John, and I guess I like it because it's my favourite gospel, because it's more satisfying as a literary work. You know, it's got a sonorous language to it that the others don't have, and it flows like a piece of exalted rhetoric, which the others, to me, don't do. But I'm beginning to wonder, when it was written, if it was written at the time it was written, could the writer have known Jesus, or is the writer just picking up stories about Jesus that he or she has gathered through reading Mark and the other Gospels? What's the historic likelihood that the Gospel writer actually knew Jesus or saw Jesus?
That's the thing I think about John. John's Gospel writes like an eyewitness account all the way through.
John's Gospel is probably quite late. The problem we have is John's Gospel is probably written quite late, which would make the author around 100 or maybe at the earliest 70s. So there's issues around the age of the author, depending on when you date John's Gospel. It's not impossible, Ian, but it's not also possible to actually prove it. You can equally say, I think, Derek, that the synoptics are written like eyewitnesses' accounts as well, because they give direct speech from Jesus and they tell you details of his various miracles and his teachings and what he's doing. So all of them present that way. I think you're right about the language of John, Ian. It's the most beautiful Greek. It's absolutely superlative Greek that John writes. And it's full of literary things. There's literary devices such as metaphors and similes. There's all this symbolism of night and day, dark and light, life and death. There's at least 3 layers to everything that John says in terms of meaning, and that's quite deliberate. He has a lot of little literary things he puts in there, like Jesus will say something, people take it literally and they don't understand what he means, and that includes Nicodemus, the disciples, the Samaritan woman. This story here we've looked at the beginning of John when he says about the temple will be destroyed and raised up in 3 days. That is a really common trope through the Gospel of John. So it is a literary construction. It's really done very deliberately using metaphor, symbolism, narrative devices that point to different truths about Jesus. The fact that it's more theological leads scholars to think it's later, because the concentration isn't on how Jesus lived as such. The concentration is on what Jesus taught, if you can see what I'm saying. And the fact there's only 7 signs, that's a magical number in the Bible, 7, and a lot of them aren't in the synoptics, but they all have a specific place within the Gospel of John. They're carefully placed and they're there for a reason in the story. Suggests that this is a highly well-crafted, well-thought-out gospel. This isn't something that John's just penned off at random.
That raises an interesting issue. If it's in Greek, such a work of great erudition, how could a simple fisherman from up the top of the Sea of Galilee, who wouldn't have been educated in Greek, how could a simple fisherman write this work of great erudition?
That's a good point, Ian, because Aramaic is what the fishermen would have spoken. That was the language of the common folk of the day. And this is excellent Greek. This is someone who thinks and writes and has been educated in Greek, has put this gospel together. This isn't, Mark's gospel the Greek is a lot more simple. There's a lot more mistakes in it, grammatically, for instance. not in the Gospel of John. You don't get mistakes. So this is probably a Hellenized Jew we're looking at here, who's been brought up in the Hellenistic world and educated to understand Koine Greek. Now, Koine Greek was the language of commerce, so it was known, at least in a rudimentary form, across the Roman Empire, and you'd find nearly all the merchants that were trading regularly with Rome across the empire would know this language. It's a bit like English has become the language of commerce in our world today. So it's not impossible that the disciples who were fishermen would know something of Koine Greek. That's not impossible, because they may have been trading their fish, but whether they'd know it to the level of that this author knows it, it's quite another question.
The other interesting point that occurs to me is, if it's a highly educated Hellenized Jew who's writing it, he's obviously believed the message. Whatever he's heard about Jesus, or if he's known Jesus himself, he's a believer. He's believed
Absolutely.
what Jesus said he was.
Yes, I don't think there's any question of that. He's believed that, and he's setting it out. But I mean, this is someone who is a highly educated person. This is like reading what we'd call Oxford English or the Queen's English. That's the sort of Greek John has. It's formal, but it's also highly poetic, and it uses all these poetic ways of expressing itself. So it's a lovely gospel to read. And because his grammar's always right, it's good for a beginning Greek student. One of the first passages I translated was chapter 1 of the Gospel of John, because his grammar is so perfect. It's not like Mark, where you're sitting there thinking, now, what does he mean? Because this is not making any sense. You don't have that problem with John when you're doing that. We should start winding up now. So John might want to tell you some other things or point some things out in your handout and what we're doing this week.
Well, I've got a couple of quotes from church fathers. I can't let a session get away.
I could easily let a session get away without the church fathers.
You are bad.
They noticed this difference between John and the Synoptics. Jerome, writing on illustrious men around 400, so probably at least 3 centuries after John's Gospel was written, said, John, the apostle whom Jesus most loved, the son of Zebedee and brother of James, the apostle whom Herod after our Lord's passion beheaded. So you can see he's really identifying strongly John there. Most recently of all the evangelists, in other words, closest in time to him, so he recognizes this to be the last gospel written, wrote a gospel when he had read Matthew, Mark, and Luke and approved indeed the substance of the history and declared that the things they said were true, but that they had given the history of only 1 year, the one that is which follows the imprisonment of John and in which he was put to death. That's the chronology that Derek was talking about earlier. So passing by this year, in other words, that stuff is not recorded in John's Gospel, the events of which had been set forth. He related the events of the earlier period before John was shut up in prison. So it might be manifest to those who should diligently read the volumes of the 4 apostles. And Jerome says this takes away the discrepancy which there seems to be between John and the others. So
in your dreams, Jerome.
Yeah, I know. So there's issues in that, but that's one explanation. Notice that both 400 people are clearly attuned to the difference between these gospels.
What I want to know is how did John become the disciple that Jesus loved? The only disciple that Jesus said his love was Lazarus.
That's right, exactly.
That's
yeah,
exactly, Derek.
And so it's somewhere.
I've read an account that suggests that Lazarus was the person who wrote the gospel.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's suggested. So somewhere in the tradition, the apostle whom Jesus most loved gets identified with John for whatever reason. Yeah.
It's
Well,
not,
some
it's
people
not,
you
I can't
really
find,
like
I
and
can't
some
find
people
anywhere
you
in the
don't.
Gospels where it says that Jesus loved John.
Yes,
He
but
loved,
you know,
he loved
No.
Lazarus, and he loved Mary and Martha.
And in
well,
fact,
maybe Mary wrote it, Derek.
and in fact, in John's Gospel in chapter 21, which probably is a later edition, it's where Peter, 3 times he's asked Peter, do you love me? If so, feed my sheep. So Peter was the one who loved Jesus. And, oh no, that's the other way around, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
in chapter 21, John, the Zebedee brothers were mentioned,
yeah.
and 2 other unnamed disciples, which is, you know, it still doesn't say that the disciple that Jesus loved was John. It doesn't say that.
No, it doesn't say that, Derek. That's quite right.
Yep. So around the same time as Jerome, Augustine wrote a number of tractates on John, probably between 408 and 420. And in one of them, he says that John spoke about the Lord's divinity in a way that no one else ever did. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he quotes a writer whom he doesn't name, unfortunately, who says, the eagle flies higher than any other birds and alone sets its unblinking gaze upon the rays of the sun. And that's how, so you know that in early Christian tradition, like in the 3rd or 4th century, each of the Gospels gets associated with one of the figures in the visions of Ezekiel, which are also found, I think, in Revelation. And the 4th of those figures is the eagle. And so Augustine is quoting this writer that says John's Gospel is like the eagle, flying higher than any other birds, giving a very different picture. Earlier than that, around 200, Clement of Alexandria had said this very famous thing about John's Gospel. We don't have Clement's work called the Outlines, but we do have this quote of him by Eusebius. Eusebius had a lot of material at his disposal in the early 300s when he was writing his church history. And unfortunately, we don't have all of those books, but he has quoted Clement saying, John, last of all, recognizing John was the last to write, John, noticing that the physical things had been set forth in the other Gospels, being urged by his contemporaries and inspired by the Spirit, wrote a spiritual gospel. And that's where that's picked up in Christian tradition, that John writes a spiritual gospel compared to the others. So there's some of the explanations that are offered by the venerable church fathers of antiquity.
In the bin with you, Augustine.
Next week, next week we will look at the first 18 verses of chapter 1. And we'll think about the word, and we'll think about the witness to the word. You should have got on your emails some of the wisdom passages that we'll be looking at in association with John 1. I'll send that out with the material for next week's session as well when that comes out.